Lory Dance, you're a visiting senior researcher at Lund University and an associate professor of sociology and ethnic studies at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. The teenaged other is a recurrent theme in your work, especially teenagers in urban spaces, that is the inner city in the US and the suburbs in Sweden. Can you tell me about this work and how you use post-colonial perspectives to understand the positions of these teenagers?
Yes. First, when I first started thinking of the other, I hadn't looked at post-colonial theory, but in looking at teenagers in schools back in the 1990s, there was an absence of student voice. Student voices weren't there. So post-colonial theory then gave me a way to think about the many ways in which persons who matter can be absent from discourses. And of course, beyond what sociology looks at, post-colonial theory looks at absences in literary texts, absences in artwork, or presences that are very much one-dimensional and stereotypical. So then I would say that post-colonial writers like Fanon, and looking at the psychological impacts of kind of colonial practices on persons, Spivak's notion of subaltern, even other ways in which Said, for example, looks at the way in which the other gets constructed against a superior space like the West, and a so-called inferior space. In his instance, he's talking about the Orient. But I end up looking at mostly Black and Latino youth in the US, and then when I come to Sweden, I'm interested in their counterpart. So what overlaps with post-colonial theory is the way in which their voices end up being absent from important discourses about them. And so one way that I look at the other, in a way that post-colonial theory can be useful, is the discourses about them in newspaper articles, or the discourses about them as told by politicians. And I see a real absence of the actual students themselves when I listen to politicians talking, or when I listen to read newspaper reports or listen to news accounts. They show up only as stereotypes. And so I add too, I instead of maybe a post-colonial theme in particular, although some of this also shows up in Fanon's work, I use the lens of social death, which is probably, arguably, a more sociological concept. And so what's interesting, though, when you think about teenagers, and I look mostly at teenagers in urban spaces, but also I've looked at teenagers in some rural spaces as well, but when you look at teenagers in these low-income spaces, when I'm working with them ethnographically, they're alive, they're funny, and by that I mean lively, not just living. I haven't yet figured out how to work with teenagers who aren't living. But they're lively, they're funny, they have dreams, they have hopes, they have aspirations, they make mistakes, they recover from their mistakes. But then, as I listen to politicians talking about these teenagers, especially since they are coming from spaces of marginality, or if I read newspapers, they're socially dead. They're written about as if they're persons ineligible for personhood, as Maria Cacho says, or as Hannah Arendt would say, persons without the right to have rights. So that's one of the ways that I kind of have a cross between post-colonial theory and then kind of maybe other theoretical perspectives, but then social death being that lens. So newspaper articles, nightly news reports, politicians talking about students coming from marginal spaces, the suburbs of Sweden or the inner cities of the United States, describe these students, these very lively students, as persons ineligible for personhood, as thugs, as gangsters, as criminals, as terrorists, as persons who lack dreams, who lack aspirations. And that's very different from the teenagers that I hang out with.
Hadrian, can you say anything about comparisons between the US and Sweden? You see the same patterns?
I see similar patterns. I see in newspapers in the U.S. much more specific bio-racial descriptions of these students. So it's of course, race is a social construct to start with, but when you see that implied in newspapers in the U.S., they are having very racist discourses that are linked to the biology of the students, or the students are criminal by birth or by origin. In Sweden, it tends to be more coded. The language tends to be far more coded. And I have to know that if they're talking about satellite discs or dialects or ways of speaking, that now they're talking about immigrants. Sometimes they'll say immigrants, but sometimes it's a more coded language. And in addition to that, it's not so much of a bioracial type of exclusion or othering. It's a biocultural othering. And so then that the other, this teenage other, isn't racially different from us, because that's a bad thing. That's a bad word. You don't use that word in Sweden. But then you use culture in a way that really resembles race. Because you see these students, as I would say, Vijay Prashad would argue, wrapped not in different biological skins, but wrapped in different cultural skins. And then you essentialize them and dehumanize them just the same as if they were dehumanized by these more bio-racist discussions.
Thank you, Lory Dance.
You're welcome.